Serious people who were in prison during 9/11. What was that like? Well, I have never heard anyone ask this before, and so many people don't believe this story that I don't even bother telling it. I was in prison during 9/11 in what was called high risk, but most people would understand, maximum security. It was a 2-story section of cells where you went when you had been really bad in prison and gotten too many cases. We had been on complete lockdown for a while. No TV, no anything. The guards hated us because we were dicks and only came back there when they were required to. It was football season and we had been decently good, hoping to talk the guards into letting us watch a Cowboys game. This was maybe 2 weeks after 9/11. During the game they kept showing video of planes crashing into buildings. A guard was walking by checking on us and someone asked why they kept showing it. That's when we were told that we had been attacked a couple weeks prior. Don't really remember what I felt about it because even then we didn't know a lot about it. That's kinda fucked up. I was in a max prison in Texas at the time. I was in the infirmary talking to the PA when a nurse came in and told the doctor that a plane had just crashed into the WTC. A little bit later she came in again crying, telling the PA that another plane had just crashed into the second tower. All 3 of us came out of the room into the lobby, where someone had rolled a TV in. We all watched the news broadcast. The people crying, footage of the planes crashing, everything. In prison, prisoners segregate themselves according to race and then by city. Then there's more segregation between prisoners and guards, nurses, etc. But at that brief moment, we were all standing there watching the TV and all those lines of separation were gone. When those towers were attacked, we were all attacked. We were all feeling sadness, worry, anger. I remember walking back to my building and everyone was quiet. Guards weren't giving us a hard time. Inmates were more quiet than usual. Just a dark cloud over the prison. Hey, a question I can answer. I had just recently arrived in the system after sitting in county for a while. So was still in diagnostics, where all your processing like medical and affiliations and job placement stuff happens. I remember being still asleep when a guard turned on the lights and rolled the TV into the door. Monsieur, intakes had been torn down by the last batch. Or maybe the batch before the monsieur. I remember my bunk was right by the plug, so I could sit there and be right to the side of the TV. My house was popular for a few days. Lol. Everyone was confused at first. What the hell, boss? Why, you waking us up? Quote. But his demeanor showed that something serious was up. Big gray-headed dude, usually jovial, was like, "Y'all quiet down and look at this." We thought it was just a crash at first. But he answered, "No, we're under attack." I'm not super sure about the timeline. He must have brought it on shortly after the Pentagon got hit. I remember seeing one of the towers fall, at least, but the memory is fuzzy. We were one somber bunch of hoodlums, though. They left the TV in the dorm all that day, and most of the next. Like others have said, we didn't go out for a few days. We didn't go full lockdown, because they kept running the diagnostic stuff. But I can't speak for the rest of the camp. Among the inmates, it was gossip as usual. Hype to the walls. There's gonna be a war. They're gonna let us out. Gonna write my recruiter and get out of here. Blah blah blah. The couple Middle Eastern looking guys got some shit, but no beatings. At least in my pod. Again, stuck in intake, so dunno about the rest of the camp. There was perhaps an increased sense of camaraderie, and lots of talk from the veterans in the group. I guess I've never really thought about that morning from the perspective of anyone other than myself or a New Yorker before. Strange memory. Thanks for asking, person. As a former inmate, this is the first answer I've read that looks like you were actually there. It was shortly after count had cleared and I had just walked outside to the yard before going to my job in the education department. The inmate I worked with asked me if I heard that we were at war and that they had attacked New York. I remember my belly was in and not thinking, oh shit, we're at war and I'm stuck in here and my family is out there. I grew up in the 80s and remembered that Cold War fear that the Russians were gonna take over the country, so that's what I was thinking when I heard war. I was only a few years into a very long sentence, so I didn't know what to think. When we went into the classroom, we rigged the TV to catch channels over the antenna. We were all glued to the TV, and I'll never forget watching people jump to their deaths. I called my folks and said we loved each other, and my dad reassured me that we weren't going to be taken over by another country. We had like 15 channels on TV in our units, and I remember every single channel had the news on. Even bet when it happened, I was at college in the UK and none of us had access to the TV. The Russians bombed America was the first rumor that spread around before the full story was known. We were all absolutely petrified that nukes were going to start flying until we got on the buses home and the radio clarified the situation. If I remember right, that first day, the only network that didn't change programming was the Cartoon Network. I don't know if it was so kids and adults could have something safe to watch or what, but it was a good thing. I also remember the teenage daughter of someone who died on one of the planes said that for a long time after her mother died, she'd watched nothing but the Food Network, because it was the only network that never mentioned 9/11. I was in prison in Missouri at the time. Minimum security camp, Tipton. Even though there wasn't much of a security risk inmate-wise, when the planes hit, it was about 30 minutes later everyone was told to report back to our buildings. Temporary lockdown was in place, and the closest military base had fighter jets on patrol almost immediately. Even though we had to go on lockdown, almost everyone was already in a cubicle watching as the second plane hit. Holy fuck was about the most common expletive. As was that fucking real? Quote, religious groups were the main concern, as there was a strong Nation of Islam and Muslim population. Luckily I was part of a multi-faith group, being with my main Wiccan group mainly, that spoke and shared beliefs, experiences, and sat in on each other's respective faith meetings and ceremonies. It was a very unique and interesting in-between sort of group and time for about a month after 9/11 happened. I like to think the openness, our eclectic mix of faiths possessed, helped bridge the gap between opposite groups and their response to such an extreme point in our history. 9/11 be damned. I want to know more about that Wiccan group you were in during your time in prison. How was that like? Were people actually into the whole Wicca religion? Was it like some sort of prison gang for hippies? None were really hippies. There were a few who studied things like the Golden Dawn stuff, Crowley works. Even some mysticism and shamanism were included within. There were even a couple of Satanism and demonologists in the group. I was in prison from October 2000 to June 15, 2002. On June 3, 2001 I took my Shahada, became a Muslim. As a white inmate this was pretty difficult. I was the only white Muslim in the prison I was in, so there were some extra heat on me for that. But it had subsided. September 11, 2001 I was awoken by another inmate, turned on the TV and watched the second plane hit live while the first was smoking. We, the Muslim community, were all approached by the staff and were all offered protective custody status once they figured out it was a terrorist attack and Osama bin Laden was one of the masterminds. It was a very trying time. We would make solid pray on the yard in the evening together. It was a scary time. We had a few meetings with outside ministers and imams where we all tried to come together and understand things. For us, they shut down the yard. When we went inside, the TV was on, which wasn't normal for that time of day, so we all knew that something was up. Then we watched as the towers fell. They let those of us with famine and why call them to check on the monsieur felt helpless AF. We didn't know what happened. We all thought somebody escaped. That's what the older prisoners told us anyway. No TV, no newspapers, no radio. No work. We were kitchen staff and served 2 meals per day. And we didn't have trays. Instead it was bagged lunch for everybody. PB&J and a carton of milk. For 3 days. After the first 12 to 15 hours the older inmates were telling us it could be a riot in another block, because it was too quiet. Any stirs by the inmates, the loudspeaker would come on and tell us we are on lockdown. When we found out, 72 hours later, it was total shock. We were in California and we didn't know if our families were okay or what. I had to wait 2 hours to make a phone call to my family. I had to have my family in CA contact family in NJ and tell them to accept the collect call from me. I wouldn't take anybody's word that everyone was alive. During 9/11, I was incarcerated at the Correctional Industrial Facility in Pendleton, Indiana, serving a 30-year sentence for murder. I was working in the chapel as a clerk, just outside of the chaplain's office. In his office was a TV. And when the first plane struck the WTC and the news flash interrupted the current program, I was in shock that such a horrific accident could happen. When the second plane struck, I knew in that instant that it was not an accident, but a deliberate act of war against the United States. At that moment, the guards and administration also recognized that a serious national event was occurring. All work details were immediately canceled, and all of us inmates were escorted back to our cells. The entire prison was eerily quiet because everyone was either in shock or realized that the United States had just suffered an act of war. The prison was placed on lockdown, not only to prevent rioting, but also because no one knew what was going to happen in the coming hours or days. My cellmate had a TV, and we watched in horror as the events of the day unfolded. There were some inmates who found pleasure in the government being attacked, but these were very much in the minority. The vast majority of inmates, especially the veterans, were horrified. There were many times when I was in prison that I felt helpless and incapacitated, but never more so than on September 11, 2001. If I could have, I would have rushed to New York to dig through the rubble with my bare hands. But I couldn't. Never had I felt so acutely the crushing weight of those walls and those bars. I am a naturalized citizen, by choice, because I love this country. I committed a crime, and I paid my debt, but I harbor no ill will against the government for my incarceration. I broke the law. I got what I deserved. The United States is the greatest nation on earth, my incarceration notwithstanding, and on that day I would have done whatever was necessary to protect it. If only I could have. To this day, that is one of my greatest regrets. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.